You saw it. Deep down, you felt something was wrong. That unexplainable tension in your chest when the news played the same empty reassurances. That moment when you looked around and realized everyone was pretending everything was normal. You are not crazy. You are not alone. Thousands of people across the world are experiencing the exact same feeling right now. And there is a reason for it. What if I told you that the final warning has already been given, but it was designed so perfectly that almost no one recognized it for what it was? While you were busy with work, family, and daily routines, something fundamental shifted beneath the surface of civilization, and the silence that is coming will change everything. Right now, you have a choice. You can close this video and go back to pretending nothing is happening. Or you can stay with me for the next few minutes and finally understand what that uneasy feeling has been trying to tell you. I promise you this. By the end of this video, you will see the world differently. You will recognize the pattern that has been hiding in plain sight. Subscribe to this channel right now, because once you understand this, you will never be able to ignore the signs again. For months, the same pattern repeated itself across multiple countries and institutions without anyone connecting the pieces. Specialists in various fields noticed anomalies in their respective areas, but assumed these were isolated incidents. Financial analysts saw irregular market behaviors that defied traditional economic models. Climate scientists recorded atmospheric changes that their instruments struggled to explain properly. Social psychologists documented shifting behavioral patterns in populations that seemed coordinated, despite having no apparent coordination mechanism. Each group of experts observed their own fragment of a much larger picture, but nobody stepped back far enough to see the complete image forming. The warnings were there, carefully documented in academic journals and technical reports that few people outside specialized circles ever read. Conferences were held where researchers presented troubling data to audiences of their peers. Panel discussions explored the implications of these findings with appropriate scientific caution, but the conclusions remained trapped within professional communities, never breaking through into mainstream awareness. The general public continued scrolling through social media, watching entertainment programs, and planning their next vacations while the foundation of their reality quietly transformed. What made this sign so easy to ignore was its gradual nature. There was no single dramatic moment that forced everyone to pay attention simultaneously. Instead, the change crept forward incrementally. Each small shift, barely noticeable compared to the previous day. Human psychology is poorly equipped to detect slow-moving threats that lack immediate visceral impact. Our brains evolved to respond to sudden dangers like predators or natural disasters, not to abstract patterns that unfold over months or years. Media outlets contributed to the collective blindness by focusing on sensational stories that generated clicks and views. Genuine warnings from credible sources were buried beneath celebrity gossip, political scandals, and viral videos of dancing animals. When experts did manage to get interviewed, their nuanced explanations were reduced to 10-second sound bites that stripped away all meaningful context. The result was a population that felt informed but actually understood nothing about the real dangers approaching. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 33, verse 6, we read, "But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at the watchman's hand." This biblical principle speaks directly to our current situation. The watchmen saw the danger and attempted to sound the alarm, but their warnings were systematically ignored or suppressed by those who found the message inconvenient. Some individuals tried to bring attention to the emerging pattern through blogs, independent media channels, and public presentations. They compiled evidence, created visual demonstrations, and attempted to communicate the urgency of what they had discovered. But they were quickly labeled as conspiracy theorists or alarmists by mainstream gatekeepers. The very act of pointing out the pattern became socially stigmatized, creating a chilling effect that silenced potential whistleblowers who feared professional and personal consequences. The sign was ignored, not because it was invisible, but because acknowledging it would have required uncomfortable changes to comfortable lifestyles. People would have had to question assumptions they had held their entire lives. Institutions would have had to admit fundamental errors in their operating principles. Leaders would have had to confess that they had been guiding society in the wrong direction. So instead, everyone collectively agreed to pretend the sign was not there, even as it grew larger and more obvious with each passing day. Comment below. What signs in your own life have you been ignoring because acknowledging them would be too uncomfortable? The silence we are discussing is not the absence of noise or the quiet of a peaceful evening. It is something far more profound and far more terrifying. This silence represents the moment when options disappear, when doors that once stood open slam shut permanently, when the possibility of course correction vanishes completely. It is the silence that follows the final warning, the quiet that settles over a situation that has moved beyond the point where human intervention can make any meaningful difference. And it is approaching faster than most people realize. This is not a sudden event that will announce itself with dramatic fanfare. There will be no countdown clock visible to everyone, no emergency broadcast system activation that interrupts regular programming. Instead, the silence arrives through a gradual process that unfolds so smoothly that most people will not recognize it until they are already trapped within it. One day you wake up and realize that conversations you used to have are no longer possible. Questions you used to ask are no longer answered. Choices you used to possess have been quietly removed from the table. The silence begins when we collectively stop asking the right questions, when curiosity is replaced by passive acceptance, when critical thinking is traded for comfortable narratives that require no mental effort, when inconvenient truths are dismissed as negativity that disrupts our carefully maintained illusions of control and security. Every time someone says, "I don't want to think about that right now," or "I'm sure someone else is handling it," they contribute another brick to the wall of silence being constructed around us. Educational systems have played a role in preparing populations for this silence by teaching people what to think rather than how to think. Students are trained to memorize approved answers and regurgitate them on standardized tests. Original questioning is discouraged as disruptive. Independent research is viewed with suspicion. The result is generations of people who are highly educated in narrow technical skills, but completely unprepared to recognize systemic deceptions or question official narratives that contradict observable reality. In the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 24, verse 12, Jesus warned, "And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." This cooling of love, this withdrawal of care and concern, is itself a form of silence. When people stop caring about truth, stop caring about their neighbors, stop caring about anything beyond their immediate personal comfort, they create the psychological conditions necessary for the final silence to settle over civilization without significant resistance. Technology has accelerated the approach of this silence in ways previous generations could never have imagined. Social media platforms create echo chambers where people only encounter information that confirms their existing beliefs. Algorithms curate reality, showing each user a personalized version of the world designed to maximize engagement rather than promote understanding. Artificial intelligence systems make decisions that affect millions of lives, but their reasoning processes remain opaque black boxes that no human can fully examine or challenge. When the silence finally arrives completely, it will feel strangely normal to those who have been gradually conditioned to accept it. people will go about their daily routines, convinced that nothing fundamental has changed. They will not recognize that they are living in a fundamentally different reality than the one their parents or grandparents inhabited. And by the time recognition dawns, if it ever does, the mechanisms that could have prevented this outcome will no longer be accessible. Like this video right now, if you refuse to let this silence claim your mind without a fight. Humanity made a catastrophic mistake, and almost nobody recognized it as it was happening. People confused normalcy with safety, assuming that because things had always functioned a certain way, they would continue functioning that way indefinitely. This psychological error has been repeated throughout history by civilizations that collapsed suddenly after centuries of apparent stability. The Romans believed their empire was eternal. The Mayans thought their cities would stand forever. Every fallen civilization shared this same fatal blindness in their final decades. The repetition of daily routines created a hypnotic effect that lulled populations into complacency. Wake up, go to work, consume entertainment, sleep, repeat. The predictability of this pattern became synonymous with security in people's minds. When the same basic structure persisted day after day, month after month, year after year, the human brain naturally concluded that this structure was permanent and unchangeable. The possibility that the entire system could be fragile and temporary became literally unthinkable for most people. This collective error was not random or accidental. It was systematically encouraged by institutions that benefited from population passivity. Governments promoted narratives of inevitable progress and continuous improvement. Corporations advertised lifestyles built on assumptions of endless growth and unlimited resources. Media outlets filled their programming with content designed to distract rather than inform, to pacify rather than activate. The entire social machinery worked together to maintain the comfortable illusion that everything was fine and would remain fine. Educational institutions taught history as a series of problems that humanity had successfully overcome through intelligence and cooperation. Students learned that every crisis eventually resolved, that every challenge ultimately yielded to human ingenuity. This relentlessly optimistic framing created a generation that expected positive outcomes automatically, without considering the possibility that some problems might not have solutions, that some crises might not resolve favorably, that some trajectories might lead to catastrophic endpoints. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 12, we find this sobering truth. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. The path that seemed obviously correct to billions of people, the road that appeared safe and reasonable, was actually leading them directly toward destruction. But because everyone around them was walking the same path, and because authority figures kept insisting the direction was correct, they never questioned whether they should turn back. The psychological trap became complete when questioning the collective direction was reframed as antisocial behavior. Anyone who suggested that the system might be fundamentally flawed was dismissed as a pessimist or troublemaker. Those who pointed out inconvenient data were accused of spreading fear and negativity. Social pressure to conform became overwhelming, creating a situation where even people who privately harbored doubts kept silent rather than face ridicule or ostracism from their communities. The entire world fell into the same trap because the trap was designed at a global scale. Communication technologies allowed the same narratives to spread across every continent simultaneously. International organizations promoted standardized approaches to problems regardless of local contexts. Economic systems became so interconnected that no nation could choose a fundamentally different path without facing severe consequences. The result was a planetary civilization with no backup plan, no diversity of approaches, no alternative models ready to deploy when the primary system inevitably failed. Subscribe to this channel now, because understanding this collective error is the first step toward avoiding its most devastating consequences. There was a precise moment when everything changed, a specific point in time when the trajectory of human civilization shifted from one path to another. But this moment was so subtle, so carefully disguised as routine business, that even the most attentive observers completely missed its significance. It did not arrive with dramatic announcements or obvious disruptions to daily life. Instead, it slipped past unnoticed, camouflaged as just another unremarkable day in an endless series of unremarkable days. This invisible turning point occurred during a period when public attention was deliberately directed elsewhere. Major news stories dominated headlines, capturing everyone's focus while the real change happened in the background. Political scandals, celebrity controversies, and manufactured crises kept populations engaged with spectacles that ultimately meant nothing. Meanwhile, in quiet meeting rooms and through encrypted communications, decisions were made that would alter the course of history. The documents were signed, the protocols were activated, and the point of no return was crossed without fanfare. What made this turn so effective was its technical complexity. The mechanisms involved were so specialized and obscure that only a handful of experts in the entire world possessed the knowledge necessary to understand what was actually happening. These experts operated within isolated professional silos, each understanding their own narrow domain, but lacking the broader perspective needed to recognize the larger pattern. By the time anyone assembled the complete picture, the window for intervention had already closed. Financial systems implemented new protocols that seemed like minor technical updates. Governments passed legislation buried in massive omnibus bills that nobody read completely. Technology companies deployed infrastructure upgrades that users barely noticed. Each individual change appeared insignificant in isolation. But when combined, these seemingly unrelated modifications created a fundamentally different operational reality. The world after the invisible turn functioned according to different rules than the world before it, even though surface appearances remained largely unchanged. In the book of Daniel, chapter 5, verse 27, we find these chilling words written on the wall. "You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting." That ancient judgment applies perfectly to our current situation. Humanity was tested at the moment of the invisible turn, and we failed the test completely. We were weighed, measured, and found lacking the vigilance and wisdom necessary to protect ourselves from sophisticated deception. Historians attempting to identify this turning point years later will struggle with the task. They will examine documents, analyze timelines, and interview surviving witnesses, but they will find no clear consensus on when exactly everything changed. Some will point to one event, others to a different moment. The truth is that the turn was designed to be historically ambiguous, spread across multiple, seemingly unrelated incidents, so that no single point could be identified as the definitive moment of transformation. The invisible turn marked the beginning of what experts quietly call the point of no return. Beyond this threshold, the momentum of events becomes self-sustaining and irreversible through normal means. Systems that could have been reformed before the turn become impossible to modify after it. Options that existed in the previous phase disappear completely in the new reality. And most tragically, the majority of people continue living as if nothing fundamental has changed, unaware that they are now operating under an entirely different set of constraints than they were just months earlier. Comment right now. Do you remember a moment in recent history when you felt something had fundamentally shifted but could not explain exactly what changed? Authorities did leave clues about what was coming, but these clues were embedded in places where most people would never think to look. Official reports contained statistical anomalies that required specialized knowledge to interpret. Government speeches included carefully worded phrases that meant one thing to casual listeners, but signaled something entirely different to those trained to decode institutional language. Press releases announced policy changes in technical jargon that obscured their true implications. The information was technically public, yet effectively hidden from public understanding. This method of communication through indirect signals has been used by power structures throughout history. Leaders cannot always speak plainly about their true intentions without triggering resistance or panic. So, they develop sophisticated methods of conveying sensitive information to key stakeholders while maintaining plausible deniability to the general population. The message gets split into two layers: the surface narrative designed for mass consumption, and the deeper meaning intended only for those who know how to read between the lines. Corporate annual reports contained forward-looking statements that hinted at massive operational changes. Banking institutions published research papers describing scenarios that seemed theoretical but were actually strategic preparations. International organizations issued policy recommendations framed as suggestions but functioning as coordinated directives. Technology companies released product roadmaps that revealed their assumptions about future social conditions. Each document alone seemed innocuous, but collectively, they painted a clear picture of the transformation being planned. The most important content was never stated explicitly in any single document or speech. Instead, it had to be assembled from fragments scattered across multiple sources, like a puzzle where each piece came from a different box. This distribution strategy ensured that only people with access to many information streams and the analytical capacity to synthesize them could discern the complete message. Everyone else received only disconnected pieces that made no coherent sense. In the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 4, verse 11 and 12, Jesus explained why he taught in parables. "To you, it has been given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those who are outside, all things come in parables, so that seeing they may see and not perceive, and hearing they may hear and not understand." This same principle operates in modern institutional communication. The message is delivered in a form that allows some to understand, while ensuring others remain confused. Independent researchers who attempted to decode these hidden messages and share their findings publicly faced systematic discrediting campaigns. Their analyses were labeled as conspiracy theories, regardless of how well documented their evidence was. Fact-checking organizations published articles disputing their interpretations without addressing the underlying data. Social media platforms flagged their content as misinformation, limiting its reach. Professional associations pressured members to distance themselves from anyone asking uncomfortable questions about official narratives. The hidden message was not a single revelation, but a mosaic of partial truths that together revealed a reality far different from what the public was being told. It described preparations for a fundamental restructuring of social, economic, and political systems. It acknowledged that current trajectories were unsustainable and that drastic measures would soon become necessary. It indicated that those in positions of authority had already accepted certain outcomes as inevitable and were positioning themselves accordingly. And it made clear that the general population would not be consulted about these decisions, only informed after the fact when resistance would no longer matter. Leave your comment. Have you noticed official communications that seem to contain meanings beyond their surface words? The true impact of this final warning extends far beyond what has been publicly acknowledged or officially discussed. Surface-level explanations focus on immediate practical effects that people can easily understand and accept. But beneath those superficial consequences lies a much deeper transformation that will fundamentally alter how human beings live, work, interact, and understand their place in the world. This undeclared consequence is what truly matters, yet it remains carefully hidden from mainstream awareness. What authorities presented as temporary adjustments or necessary adaptations are actually permanent restructurings of basic social contracts. Changes described as emergency measures will never be reversed. Powers granted to institutions under crisis conditions will never be voluntarily surrendered. Systems implemented as short-term solutions will become permanent fixtures of daily life. The temporary becomes permanent through a process so gradual that most people never recognize when the transition occurs. One day, they simply realize that what they thought was provisional has become the new normal. This consequence alters behavior at the most fundamental psychological level. People begin to internalize new assumptions about what is possible, what is acceptable, and what is inevitable. Their decision-making frameworks shift without conscious awareness of the change. Values that once seemed non-negotiable become flexible. Boundaries that once seemed absolute become permeable. And these internal transformations happen so smoothly that individuals genuinely believe they are still the same person with the same principles they have always held. Economic structures are being redesigned in ways that concentrate control while creating illusions of distributed power. Financial systems that once operated with some degree of independence now function as coordinated mechanisms of a unified global network. Individual choice persists in superficial matters, like consumer preferences, but fundamental decisions about resource allocation, production priorities, and wealth distribution occur at levels completely removed from democratic influence or market forces. In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 16 and 17, we find this prophecy. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, this passage describes a system of total economic control that matches precisely the trajectory of current developments. The undeclared consequence includes mechanisms that can exclude individuals from participating in basic commerce if they fail to comply with requirements that expand continuously. Educational and cultural institutions are implementing changes that will reshape how future generations think about fundamental questions of existence, purpose, and truth. History is being rewritten not through crude propaganda, but through subtle shifts in emphasis and framing. Scientific inquiry is being redirected away from certain questions, while being encouraged in directions that support preferred narratives. Artistic expression is being channeled toward themes that reinforce rather than challenge dominant ideologies. The result will be populations who cannot even imagine alternatives to the systems they inhabit. The undeclared consequence may ultimately redefine what it means to be human in ways that previous generations would find unrecognizable. Biological augmentation, digital integration, and cognitive modification are moving from science fiction to practical implementation faster than ethical frameworks can develop to govern them. Once these technologies reach certain adoption thresholds, social and economic pressures will effectively mandate participation. Those who refuse enhancement will find themselves unable to compete in employment markets, excluded from social networks, and marginalized in political processes. The choice to remain unmodified will become practically impossible, even if technically legal. Write in the comments. What consequences of recent changes do you think authorities are deliberately not discussing openly? Admitting the problem would require those in positions of authority to acknowledge failures so profound that their legitimacy would instantly evaporate. Leaders would have to confess that they have been guiding civilization toward catastrophe for decades while claiming to provide safety and prosperity. Institutions would have to admit that their core operational assumptions were fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Experts would have to acknowledge that their expertise was built on faulty foundations that led to systematically wrong conclusions. The psychological and political costs of such admissions would be unbearable for those who built their entire identities around being right. So instead, a collective decision was made at the highest levels to maintain silence about the true nature and scope of what is happening. This silence was not the result of conspiracy in the traditional sense, where shadowy figures gather in secret rooms to plot against humanity. Rather, it emerged organically from the shared interests of multiple powerful groups who all benefited from preventing public awareness. No explicit coordination was necessary because everyone in positions of influence understood intuitively that acknowledging the truth would destroy the systems that gave them power, wealth, and status. The silence operates through sophisticated information management strategies that go far beyond simple censorship. Inconvenient facts are not hidden, but rather buried under avalanches of trivial information that make signal indistinguishable from noise. Serious analysis is not banned, but rather marginalized by promoting entertainment and outrage as primary forms of content. Critical voices are not silenced forcibly, but rather drowned out by amplifying hundreds of competing voices that fragment attention and prevent coherent opposition from forming. The effect is total information saturation that produces population-wide ignorance, despite unprecedented access to data. Many individuals within these systems genuinely believe they are acting ethically by maintaining the silence. They convince themselves that revealing the full truth would cause panic and chaos worse than the problems being hidden. They argue that people cannot handle certain realities and are better off remaining ignorant for their own psychological protection. This paternalistic rationalization allows them to sleep at night while participating in the largest deception in human history. They see themselves as responsible stewards rather than complicit deceivers. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 6, verse 14, the prophet condemned those who said, "Peace, peace," when there is no peace. This ancient critique applies perfectly to our modern situation. Leaders who continue proclaiming that everything is fine, that problems are being managed, that the future remains bright and secure, are committing the same sin as those ancient false prophets. They offer comforting lies instead of difficult truths, because the lies serve their immediate interests regardless of long-term consequences. The silence also persists because breaking it would require confronting the reality that many cherished beliefs about progress, civilization, and human nature are demonstrably false. It would force recognition that the arc of history does not automatically bend toward justice, that technological advancement does not guarantee moral improvement, that complexity does not equal sophistication. These acknowledgements would shatter worldviews that billions of people have invested their entire lives in maintaining. The psychological devastation would be comparable to religious believers discovering definitive proof that their faith was founded on fabrications. Perhaps most importantly, the silence continues because those who could break it understand that doing so would place enormous responsibility on their shoulders. Once the truth is spoken clearly and undeniably, action becomes morally mandatory. Inaction after awareness constitutes complicity. So as long as the silence holds, everyone can continue claiming ignorance as justification for doing nothing. But the person who breaks the silence eliminates that excuse for themselves and for everyone who hears their words. That burden is heavy enough that most people, when faced with the choice, decide to remain silent and let someone else carry the weight of truth-telling. Comment. Now, what truths have you chosen to ignore because acknowledging them would require you to change your life completely? Even at this late hour, even after the final warning has been given and largely ignored, a minimal opening still exists. The window is narrowing rapidly, measured now in months rather than years, but it has not yet closed completely. What happens next depends entirely on whether enough people recognize the pattern before it completes its final phase. The key to survival and resistance lies in understanding the mechanics of the system while those mechanics are still visible and before they become completely embedded in the infrastructure of daily life. The first essential action is breaking free from information streams controlled by institutions that benefit from your ignorance. This does not mean retreating into isolated echo chambers that confirm pre-existing beliefs. Rather, it requires developing the critical capacity to evaluate information based on evidence and logic rather than source authority or emotional appeal. You must learn to ask who benefits from you believing particular narratives, what contradictory evidence is being systematically excluded, and what assumptions are being smuggled in as if they were established facts. Building parallel structures outside the dominant system is the second critical step. These include alternative communication networks that cannot be easily censored or monitored, local food production systems that reduce dependence on fragile global supply chains, community support networks that provide resilience when institutional services fail or become conditional on compliance, educational initiatives that teach genuine critical thinking rather than ideological conformity. Each parallel structure you create or support represents one less point of leverage that centralized power can use to control your choices. Recognizing the pattern requires understanding that what appears to be chaos is actually highly organized. Events that seem random or coincidental are often coordinated components of larger strategies. Crises that appear to emerge spontaneously are frequently engineered or at minimum exploited opportunistically by those who had plans prepared in advance. Once you train yourself to look for these patterns, they become visible everywhere. You start noticing how problems and solutions always seem to move in directions that concentrate power and diminish individual autonomy. In the Gospel, according to Luke chapter 21, verse 36, Jesus instructed his followers, "Watch therefore, and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." This vigilance and spiritual preparedness remain as essential now as they were 2,000 years ago. The coming challenges will test not just practical survival skills, but fundamental questions of identity, purpose, and ultimate allegiance. Connecting with others who understand what is happening creates networks of mutual support and shared knowledge. Isolation is one of the primary weapons used against those who recognize the truth. You are made to feel alone, crazy, paranoid for seeing what is obvious once the pattern is identified. But you are not alone. Millions of people across the planet are experiencing the same recognition, finding each other, organizing even in small local groups, sharing strategies and encouragement transforms individual awareness into collective capacity for resistance and resilience. The opportunity still exists because the system is not yet complete. Gaps remain where freedom of action persists. Technologies of control are deployed, but not yet ubiquitous. Enforcement mechanisms exist, but lack total coverage. Legal frameworks are being constructed, but retain some protections that can still be invoked. These gaps are closing rapidly, which is why action now matters so much more than action even 6 months from now. Every day of delay reduces options and increases the cost of resistance. Recognizing the sign at this moment might literally be the difference between having choices and having none. Subscribe to this channel immediately. because the information shared here could be the resource you need when everything else fails, and you are forced to rely on knowledge and preparation rather than hoping someone else will fix the problems for you.